The invitation to my 50-year high school reunion arrived on a Tuesday, a glossy cardstock reminder of a life I had left behind long ago. I almost tossed it straight into the recycling bin. At 68, with arthritic knees and 15 extra pounds, the last thing I wanted was to parade my aging self before people who remembered me as the lithe teenage Margaret Anderson, homecoming queen of Lincoln High's class of 1973. But something made me pause. Perhaps it was the handwritten note at the bottom from Judy Carson, now Wilson, still the perfect class secretary after all these years. "We've missed you at the other reunions, Margaret. It wouldn't be the same without you. Please come." I set the invitation on my kitchen counter, where it remained for 3 days while I contemplated all the reasons not to go. My husband Tom had passed away 5 years earlier, so I'd have no buffer against awkward conversations. I'd lost touch with everyone from Lincoln High decades ago when Tom's job transferred us to Phoenix. And most significantly, I had spent 50 years deliberately not thinking about certain events from senior year, events involving a boy named David Mitchell, and choices that had altered the course of my life. On the third day, while dusting the shelves in my home office, I came across the small wooden box I had carried through 11 relocations, 3 career changes, 1 marriage, and the raising of 2 children. I hadn't opened it in years, but I knew exactly what it contained. Mementos from high school, preserved like insects in amber, frozen in time while I had continued to age and change. With a sigh that was part resignation and part curiosity, I carried the box to my kitchen table and opened the lid. On top was my graduation tassel, the gold 73 charm tarnished with age. Beneath it lay the program from Brigadoon, the senior musical where I'd played Fiona to David Mitchell's Tommy, a dried corsage from prom, now brittle and colorless. And at the very bottom, the item I both hoped and feared would still be there, my dance card from the spring formal of 1973. In my high school, the spring formal had maintained the quaint tradition of dance cards, small booklets where girls would record the names of their dance partners for each song of the evening. It was considered quite the honor to have your card filled before the dance even began, a visible record of your popularity. My card for the 1973 spring formal should have been filled with a variety of names as befitted the homecoming queen. Instead, a single name appeared beside every dance, David Mitchell. I ran my finger across his name, written in the confident script of an 18-year-old boy who believed he could conquer the world. David, with his quiet intensity, his surprising gentleness, his dreams of becoming a doctor who actually listens to patients. David, who had been my first love, my first heartbreak, and the road not taken that had haunted the edges of my contentment for 50 years. We had been inseparable that spring semester, the classic high school golden couple, homecoming queen and star quarterback, though David had been so much more than that stereotype suggested. He read poetry, volunteered at the local hospital, and treated my thoughts and opinions with a respect few teenage boys showed their girlfriends in 1973. We had planned our future together with the beautiful certainty of youth. David would attend State University on his football scholarship, then medical school. I would study nursing at the same university. We would marry after graduation, build a life of purpose and meaning together. But life rarely follows the neat paths we envision at 18. 2 weeks before graduation, I discovered I was pregnant. In the spring of 1973, in our small Midwestern town, an unwed pregnant girl faced limited options, none of them conducive to college educations and medical careers. I never told David about the pregnancy. Instead, I broke up with him abruptly, offering no real explanation beyond vague statements about wanting different things and needing to find myself. He was bewildered, hurt, then angry. He tried to change my mind, to understand what had happened, but I remained resolute in my silence. My parents, upon learning of my condition, had quickly arranged for me to stay with an aunt in another state, where I would take a gap year before college, code for having the baby in secret and placing it for adoption. By the time the spring formal arrived, I had already made these life-altering decisions, already set in motion the machinery that would separate me from David permanently. But I attended the dance anyway. One last evening of pretending that my life wasn't about to change forever. I danced every dance with David, memorizing the feeling of his arms around me, the scent of his skin, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled down at me. I knew it was selfish, cruel even, to take these memories for myself when I was days away from disappearing from his life. But I was 18, scared, and grasping for whatever comfort I could find before facing what lay ahead. 50 years later, sitting at my kitchen table, I wondered what had become of him. Had he fulfilled his dream of becoming a doctor? Had he found someone who could give him the honesty and partnership I had not? Had he ever understood why I had left the way I did? And what of the child, my child, our child? A son or daughter who would now be 49 years old, perhaps with children of their own. I had never searched. Honoring the closed adoption as my final gift to the baby I had held only once before saying goodbye. But I had never stopped wondering, never stopped feeling the phantom presence of that missing person in my life. With a deep breath, I reached for my phone and texted my daughter Amanda. Thinking about attending my 50-year high school reunion next month. Thoughts? Her response came quickly. Yes, go, and I want all the gossip about teenage mom. I smiled at her enthusiasm. Amanda knew nothing about David or the adoption. Tom and I had met in college, married after graduation, and had Amanda and her brother Michael in my late 20s. As far as my children knew, their father was my first and only love. Another omission, another pocket of silence in a life otherwise lived with honesty and openness. Before I could overthink it, I RSVP'd yes to the reunion. Then I did what anyone in the digital age would do. I searched for David Mitchell online. I didn't expect to find much. David had never seemed the type to embrace social media or cultivate an online presence. But to my surprise, a Dr. David Mitchell appeared immediately in the search results. A recently retired physician who had practiced family medicine in our hometown for over 40 years. The accompanying photo showed an older version of the boy I remembered. Hair now silver instead of dark brown, face lined with experience, but with the same thoughtful eyes and gentle smile. My heart raced as I scrolled through the results. A local news article about his retirement mentioned his dedication to the community, the generations of families he had treated, and his plans to volunteer at a free clinic in his retirement. Another piece named him Citizen of the Year for establishing a health education program in local schools. There was no mention of a wife, though that didn't mean much. Personal details weren't typically included in professional profiles. But one photo showed him at his retirement party with a younger man and woman who resembled him enough to likely be his children. My throat tightened at the sight. David had built a good life, apparently. A life of purpose and meaning. Just as he had planned. The months before the reunion passed quickly. I found myself taking more care with my appearance, getting a new hairstyle, purchasing a dress that flattered my older but still presentable figure, even starting a daily walking routine to strengthen my knees and shed a few pounds. You're not trying to impress your old classmates, are you? I asked my reflection as I applied moisturizer with more diligence than usual. My reflection offered no reply. But we both knew the answer. The night of the reunion arrived crisp and cool, a perfect September evening that hinted at the coming autumn. The event was being held at the country club outside town, a venue that had seemed impossibly sophisticated when we were teenagers, but now struck me as charmingly provincial. I checked in, pinned on my name tag, Margaret Anderson Williams, and stepped into the ballroom where round tables surrounded a small dance floor. A DJ was playing music from our era, the Bee Gees currently entreating someone to stay alive. About 60 people milled about, some instantly recognizable despite the passage of time, others completely transformed by age. Margaret? Margaret Anderson? Oh my God, you came! Judy Carson Wilson rushed toward me, arms outstretched. She had barely changed, still petite, still perfectly put together, her blonde hair now an elegant silver bob. We hugged, exclaiming over how wonderful the other looked, falling into the rhythms of reunion small talk with surprising ease. "We've missed you at the previous reunions," Judy said, steering me toward the bar. "I was beginning to think you'd never come back to visit." "Life gets busy," I offered vaguely, but 50 years seemed worth marking. "Well, we're thrilled you're here. So many people have asked about you over the years." She looked at me with a hint of mischief. "Including a certain doctor who recently retired." My heart stuttered. "David's coming tonight? Said he wouldn't miss it." Judy squeezed my arm. "He's never married, you know. Dated plenty from what I hear, but never settled down. My theory is he never got over his high school sweetheart." I forced a laugh. "That was 50 years ago, Judy. People move on." "Some do," she conceded, "and some carry a torch for decades." "You know Susan Peters and Bill Taylor finally got married at our 40th reunion after they both lost their spouses? Sometimes life gives second chances." Before I could respond to this less than subtle hint, Judy was called away to deal with some logistical crisis, leaving me to find my assigned table. I recognized a few of my table mates, girls from the cheerleading squad, now women in their late 60s, discussing grandchildren and retirement communities. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions, reminiscences, and catching up. I explained that Tom had passed away, that my children lived on opposite coasts, that I had spent my career as a hospital administrator. I listened to stories of marriages, divorces, career triumphs, and health scares, the accumulated joys and sorrows of 50 years of adulthood. I was in the middle of examining the photo displays set up around the room, laughing at images of ourselves with towering hair and bell-bottoms, when a voice behind me said, "I'd know that laugh anywhere." I turned, and there he was, David Mitchell, aged but unmistakable, looking at me with the same intensity that had once made my teenage heart race. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." "Hello, David." My voice sounded surprisingly steady, given the riot of emotions beneath my careful exterior. "I hear you've had quite a distinguished career." He shrugged, the gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. "I did what I set out to do. Became a doctor who listens, took care of families, nothing particularly distinguished about it." "I disagree. The articles about your retirement were quite impressive." When he raised an eyebrow in question, I admitted, "I looked you up before coming tonight." "I looked you up too," he said. "Hospital administrator, 2 children, widowed 5 years ago. I was sorry to hear about your husband." "Thank you. Tom was a good man." An awkward silence fell between us, 50 years of unspoken words creating a gulf that small talk couldn't bridge. "Would you like to take a walk?" David finally asked. "It's a bit loud in here for real conversation." I nodded, relieved at the suggestion. We made our way outside to the country club's terrace, which overlooked a small lake, silver now in the moonlight. A few other escapees from the reunion stood in small groups, but we found an unoccupied bench at the far end, away from curious ears. "I have to admit," David said after we'd settled, "I wasn't sure you'd come tonight. You've missed all the other reunions." "I almost didn't," I admitted, "but 50 years seemed significant." He nodded, looking out over the water. "Do you ever think about that spring, our last semester?" My pulse quickened. "Sometimes." "I've thought about it often," he said, his voice taking on a quality I couldn't quite identify. "Especially about the way things ended between us. It took me years to stop trying to understand what happened, what I might have done wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," I said quickly. "It was me, my decisions." "Was there someone else?" His question was direct but not accusatory, as if he were asking about the weather. "No," I said firmly. There was never anyone else. He turned to look at me directly, and in his gaze I could see the remnants of that bewildered, hurt 18-year-old boy. Then why, Margaret? We had everything planned. We were happy, at least I thought we were. And then suddenly, with no warning, you ended it. 2 weeks before graduation, you completely shut me out. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. For 50 years I had kept this secret, built a life, a family, an identity, separate from that scared teenage girl. Did I really want to unravel all of that now, in my late 60s when nothing could be changed or fixed? It was a long time ago, I said finally. We were just kids. We were, he agreed. But what happened affected the adults we became. He paused. At least, it affected me. Maybe it was easier for you to move on. There was no accusation in his tone, but the words stung nonetheless. Easier? Nothing about that year had been easy. Not the warning sickness I hid from classmates, not the whispers and judgmental looks in my aunt's conservative community, not the labor endured among strangers, and certainly not the moment I handed my newborn son to the social worker, knowing I would never hold him again. It wasn't easier, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. What was? David asked gently. What happened, Margaret? Perhaps it was the kindness in his voice, perhaps the moonlight lending a dreamlike quality to the moment, or perhaps simply the relief of unburdening myself after 50 years of silence. Whatever the reason, I found myself telling him the truth. I was pregnant, I said. I found out 2 weeks before graduation. I heard his sharp intake of breath, but didn't look at him, keeping my gaze fixed on the moonlight lake as I continued. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to derail your life. Your scholarship, medical school, everything you had worked for. In 1973, there weren't many options for couples in our situation. You could have told me, he said, his voice tight with emotion. We could have faced it together. And sacrificed your future? Our futures? I shook my head. My parents arranged everything. I stayed with my aunt in Nebraska, had the baby, gave him up for adoption, and then started college the next year as if nothing had happened. That was how things were done then. Him? David's voice cracked on the word. We had a son? The raw emotion in his question made me finally turn to face him. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, his hands gripping his knees as if to steady himself. Yes, I said quietly, a healthy baby boy, born January 15th, 1974. I held him once before the adoption was finalized. He had your eyes. David was silent for a long moment, absorbing this life-altering information. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. All these years, I've had a son I never knew about, a child who grew up without me. I'm sorry, I said, inadequate words for such a monumental revelation. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving him a chance at a better life, giving you a chance to follow your dreams. That wasn't your decision to make alone, he said, a flash of the old anger briefly visible before he mastered it. I had a right to know, to be part of that decision. You're right, I acknowledged. I was 18 and terrified. I made the choice I thought was best at the time, but I've questioned it many times over the years. Have you ever looked for him? David asked. Our son? I shook my head. It was a closed adoption. I signed papers relinquishing all rights to contact or information, and I felt I had given up the right to disrupt his life. But you've wondered about him. Every day, I admitted. Especially on his birthday, wondering what he looked like, what kind of person he became, if he was happy, healthy, loved. David was quiet again, processing. I waited, prepared for his anger, his judgment, his rejection. I deserved all of it, but when he finally spoke, his voice held no condemnation. Thank you for telling me now, he said. I wish I had known sooner, but I understand why you made the choice you did. We were so young, with so much at stake. His compassion unleashed emotions I had contained for decades. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I wiped them away hastily. I never stopped regretting that I hurt you, I said. That I deprived you of knowing your son. That I handled everything so badly. David reached over and took my hand, his touch warm and steadying. We can't change the past, Margaret, but maybe we can do something about the future. What do you mean? I mean that it might not be too late to find our son. His voice gained strength as he continued. Adoption records are more open now than they used to be. There are DNA databases, search registries, and he might be looking for us too. You would want to search for him? After all this time? Wouldn't you? He countered. If there was even a small chance of meeting him, of explaining, of answering whatever questions he might have about his biological parents. I had never seriously considered searching, convinced that it would be selfish to intrude on the life my son had built without me. But hearing the hope in David's voice awakened a long-suppressed yearning. I would, I admitted. But what if he doesn't want to be found? What if he's angry or hurt or has no interest in meeting us? Then we would respect his wishes, David said simply. But shouldn't he have the chance to make that choice? As we sat together in the moonlight, the sounds of the reunion continuing inside, I felt something shifting within me, some long-held grief beginning to transform into cautious hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late to heal this oldest wound, to complete the circle that had begun 50 years ago. There's something else I should tell you, I said, reaching into my small evening bag. I brought this tonight, though I'm not sure why. I withdrew the dance card from the spring formal, preserved all these years in its little paper sleeve. David took it carefully, opening the booklet to see his name written beside every dance. You kept this? He asked, wonder in his voice. All this time? I kept everything, I admitted. Playbills, corsages, photographs. I told myself it was just nostalgia, but I think I always knew it was more than that. You were my first love, David, the one I measured all others against. He looked up from the dance card, his expression tender. And you were mine, the one who got away, as the saying goes. Inside, the DJ had started playing slower songs from our era. The strains of You've Got a Friend by James Taylor drifted out to where we sat. May I have this dance? David asked. Standing and offering his hand. For old time's sake, I placed my hand in his, allowing him to draw me to my feet. For old time's sake, I agreed. We swayed together on the terrace beneath the same moon that had witnessed our teenage romance 50 years earlier. We were no longer those young people. Life had shaped and changed us, given us experiences and wisdom we couldn't have imagined at 18. But something essential remained, a connection that had withstood time. Secrets and separation. What happens after tonight? I asked as the song neared its end. After the reunion? That's up to us, David said. We could go our separate ways again, return to our individual lives. Or we could see if there's still something worth exploring between us, whether as friends, as partners in searching for our son, or perhaps as something more given time. I'd like that, I said softly, to see what might be possible now. As the music changed to Billy Joel's Just the Way You Are, David pulled back slightly to look at me. Would you like to fill in another dance on that card? He asked, his eyes crinkling in the way I remembered. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I think I would, I said, and maybe we can start a new card altogether, for dances yet to come. He drew me close again, and we continued moving to the music, two people finding their way back to each other after a lifetime apart. Whatever came next, whether we found our son, whether we found a new connection with each other, whether we simply gave each other the gift of truth and closure, we would face it together, completing a dance that had begun 50 years before.